In a small village surrounded by dense forests, life flowed in a measured and peaceful manner. The locals knew all the rumors and legends about the forest's mysteries, but the most frightening of them all was the Witch's Circle, a tale told by the elders. No one could say where it came from, but every generation knew. Approaching it was asking for trouble. One day, a beloved dog named Rex, the cherished pet of the village children, disappeared. He was a loyal friend who always returned home by sunset, but that night he was nowhere to be found. His owner, a man named John, and his son Michael became worried when Rex didn't come back despite their calls and whistles. Friends and neighbors joined the search, taking lanterns and torches with them. From the start, the dense forest filled them with dread. The branches creaked and seemed to reach out, snagging on their clothes, while a low mist spread across the ground like a sinister blanket. After an hour of searching, Michael noticed strange tracks, Rex's paw prints, but they abruptly ended as if the dog had simply vanished. Suddenly, one of the men, an old hunter named Thomas, pointed to an unnatural glow shimmering nearby. "Look, there's something glowing over there," he said, indicating the faint light ahead. They moved toward it and found themselves facing the place spoken of only in fearful whispers, the Witch's Circle. The mushrooms forming a perfect ring were taller than usual and glowed with an otherworldly light. A cold sweat trickled down John's back. He glanced at Michael, who stood frozen, unable to tear his eyes away from the eerie sight. Thomas noticed something in the center of the circle. As they moved closer, they saw Rex's collar lying there. This is impossible," Michael whispered. At that moment, a strange murmur swept around them, as if voices were calling their names. They froze as the air filled with movement. Figures of women with long, tangled hair and hollow black eyes began to materialize from the darkness. Their faces twisted into wicked, gleeful grimaces, and they reached out to the men with claw-like hands. John grabbed Michael's arm and shouted, "Run!" The villagers fled in panic, hearing laughter and whispers behind them. The trees seemed alive, branches clawing at them, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. They burst out of the forest into the open night, where the moon shone and silence hung heavy. Rex's collar lay on the ground. The strange symbol carved into it seemed alive, glowing a faint green. No one could explain what it meant, but everyone understood. The Witch's Circle had awakened. From that night on, no one dared enter the forest, and whispers of Rex's disappearance were spoken in hushed tones, as if it was a curse better left unmentioned. The events of that night left a deep mark on the villagers. John couldn't sleep, constantly replaying the images of the sinister figures and the strange symbol on Rex's collar. Michael, though younger, felt that something was wrong. The symbol haunted him. He knew he had seen it somewhere before, but couldn't remember where. A few days after Rex's disappearance, an old village woman named Agatha, known as the local healer and keeper of ancient secrets, came to John's house. Her face was serious, and her eyes were full of concern. She asked to see the collar they had found in the Witch's Circle. Agatha took it in her hands, ran her fingers over the symbol, and suddenly went pale. "This is a witch's mark, an ancient sign used to bind souls to the forest," she said, looking into John and Michael's eyes. "If this symbol has appeared, it means old powers have awakened. The forest demands its sacrifice." John clenched his fists. The thought of his lost dog and the unknown danger clouded his mind. "What do we do, Agatha? We can't just wait for the forest to take someone else." Agatha sighed. "There's only one way to calm the forest. return what belongs to it. We need to find the witch's circle and perform a banishing ritual, but it's dangerous. No one knows what could happen." Michael, who had been standing by silently, suddenly remembered an old book he had seen in the village library. It contained symbols similar to the one carved on Rex's collar. He told John and Agatha about it. Agatha looked at him with surprise. "You must bring me that book. It could hold the key to understanding the ritual." The next day, as the sun began to paint the village rooftops with gold, Michael ran to the old library, where dusty books were kept and passed down through generations. Finding the right tome, he returned home, where Agatha was waiting with herbs, candles, and other mystical items prepared. Evening came. The silence of the forest grew more ominous. John, Michael, and Agatha made their way to the witch's circle, lighting their path with torches. The sense of dread deepened with every step. When they reached the spot, the forest seemed to come alive. Leaves whispered, branches creaked, and a sinister laughter echoed from afar. Agatha stepped into the center of the circle, laid the collar down, and began chanting. The symbol on the collar began to glow, responding to her voice. Suddenly the same female figures John and Michael had seen that night appeared around them, their faces even clearer, eyes empty and full of malice. Agatha's voice trembled as she continued the chant, and the air thickened with dark energy. The symbol glowed brighter, and the hairs on John's arms stood on end. The forest buzzed with a strange whisper, as if the trees themselves were speaking, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers trying to snatch them. Michael's eyes darted between Agatha and the dark silhouettes emerging from the shadows. The women with wild, matted hair moved unnaturally, as if hovering above the ground. Their faces contorted into grotesque, toothy grins, sharp as needles. They surrounded the circle, their whispers blending into a single excruciating wail. "Don't stop, Agatha!" John shouted, but his voice was swallowed by a rumble that came from the very bowels of the earth. The old healer's voice grew louder, but her face turned pale with fear. The light from the collar spread, filling the circle with a sickly green glow, and suddenly one of the figures lunged forward, grabbing Agatha's arm with fingers cold as ice and eyes burning with hatred. Agatha wrenched herself free, but her face was twisted with terror. She turned to John and Michael. "Stay together, they feed on fear." But it was too late. Michael felt something cold and slimy wrap around his leg. Looking down, he saw that the roots of the trees had come alive, turning into long, grasping tendrils. One of the figures reached out, nearly touching his face, and in that instant the world was engulfed in freezing darkness. John lunged at his son, swinging his torch. The fire forced the figures to retreat momentarily, their faces twisting in rage. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on their twisted forms. Agatha continued chanting, and each word echoed in the forest, turning the whispering into a shrill screech. The ground beneath them shook, and from the center of the circle a column of black smoke rose. It twisted and solidified into a figure with eyes like two burning coals that seemed to pierce into their souls. The entity spoke in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar. "You have awakened us. Now the reckoning is inevitable." The forest groaned, and the figures pressed in closer, their faces increasingly distorted, their hands reaching for the group, and the air filled with the stench of decay and rot. Agatha, standing in the circle's center, fought back panic, holding onto the words of her chant like a lifeline. Each sound that left her lips seemed to be the only thing keeping them from plunging into madness. The dark entity continued to stare, its gaze cold and consuming, like the abyss itself. John, trying to protect Michael, swung his torch, but the fire seemed feeble against the surrounding darkness. The witches hissed and advanced, their clawed hands reaching out. One of them suddenly leapt forward with unnatural speed, mouth open in a silent scream that reeked of decay. John fell backward, his torch flying from his hands and extinguishing. Michael screamed as the witch loomed over his father, but just then Agatha, her face covered in sweat and paled with fear, shouted the final words of the chant. The earth in the center of the circle cracked open, and a brilliant searing light burst forth. The witches howled as their shapes disintegrated into dust. The dark figure paused, its eyes flaring in anger before dissolving into the night along with the other shadows. For a moment the forest was enveloped in dead silence. The air turned cool and fresh, and the tension that had gripped them faded. John lay on the ground, breathing heavily, his hands shaking. Michael threw his arms around him, tears of relief and terror streaming down his face. Agatha, swaying from exhaustion, stepped forward and picked up Rex's collar, now dull and devoid of its eerie glow. "We did it," she whispered, "but the forest does not forgive so easily. Beware of its signs." As they made their way back to the village, they glanced back one last time and saw the witches' circle, once so terrifying and aglow, slowly disappearing beneath fallen leaves as if it had never existed. But in their hearts, the memory of the figures and the eerie whispers lingered. A few days later, on a cold, foggy evening, Michael stepped out onto the porch. He no longer heard the ominous whispers, but a deep-seated fear of the forest remained, as if it breathed with a life of its own. Suddenly, in the stillness, he heard a familiar bark coming from the forest path. "Rex!" Michael shouted, disbelief and hope in his voice. John, hearing his son's call, rushed outside. The barking grew louder, and out of the shadows emerged Rex, dirty but alive. His tail wagged furiously, and his eyes gleamed with joy. The dog ran up to Michael and John, licking their hands and faces as if afraid of being lost again. "It can't be," John whispered, dropping to his knees and hugging Rex tightly. Michael, tears of happiness streaming down his face, clung to the dog, feeling its warmth and heartbeat. They exchanged glances, and for a moment all their fears melted away. Agatha, passing by, paused and watched the touching scene with a faint smile. "The forest returned what it took," she said quietly. "But remember, there is always a price." Her eyes held a wisdom mixed with hidden worry. Rex now stayed close to home, never wandering far into the forest. It was as if he knew something they could never truly understand. The village settled into peace once more, but those who knew the story of the witches' circle looked at the forest with both respect and fear, aware that it was always watching, waiting to claim what was rightfully its own. Please write in the comments, support the video with a like, and of course subscribe to the channel. If it's not difficult for you, I will be pleased. You can also share this video with your friends. They will probably also be interested.